Let's see. When they arrived in Jerusalem, starting in verse 4, they were welcomed by the community and the emissaries and the elders. They reported all that God had done in helping them. But some belonging to the party of the Pharisees who had believed stood up, saying, "It is necessary to circumcise them and command them to keep the Torah of Moses." Okay? So
there's two questions, actually.
Right. There's two, because this is where really there has to be an understanding of an appreciation for the fact that religiously, Jewish literature is not really that redundant, right? Particularly when it comes to matters of theology and spirituality. Being redundant is actually one of the things that is against certain precepts that are outlined in Pirkei Avot, right? Is not wasting words, and redundancy is wasting words, right?
That and it's a waste of ink. Ink and parchment is expensive back then.
Right. Exactly. So we already know that circumcision is implicit, right, in the law of Moses. It's already part of the Torah. So you don't need to mention physical circumcision, right? The circumcision of the flesh. That if you're already going to mention the Torah, then you didn't need to mention it prior to, right? Because that's a redundancy. But Peter's answer actually gives us a little more insight into what's being referenced here. So in verse 7, it says, "After much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, 'Brothers, you know that in the early days God chose from among you, by my mouth, the Gentiles should hear the message of the good news and believe. And God who knows the heart, testified to them by giving them the Ruach HaKodesh, just as he also did for us. He made no distinction between us and them, purifying their hearts through faith. Why then do you put God to the test by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear?'" This is where a little bit of historical context and logic comes in. The common understanding of this is that, well, he's referring to the law, right? Because nobody could do the law. It's impossible. Couldn't be done. Well, that's just not true. The law in and of itself says that it can be done. And not only that, you're not going to find that in Jewish theology anywhere. You can search through the depths of even the Qumran texts, right? You can search through Talmud, Mishnah. You can dive deep into Sepharia. You're never going to find an idea that Torah is impossible to keep.
The Torah says the opposite, in fact.
Right. And well, not only that, John, right? 1 John 5:3 says the opposite. So we already have confirmation in the New Testament that this isn't even a thought that the apostles had, right? We know that they didn't think this way. So we have to set that idea aside, right? Understand that they were Jews. They had already grown up doing the Torah. This was part of the lifestyle that they lived in. So that's a burden they had already borne. Also, remember, they were Jews. They had all been circumcised on the 8th day, right? So that is also a burden they had already borne. So what are they talking about? What is a burden that none of them, being Jewish men, had ever borne at this point? That coincidentally is also called circumcision back in this day.
Yeah, that's another. So for those not tracking quite yet, the conversion process is a lot of the times shorthanded into the phrase circumcision. But it's a whole process. It's a process that can take anywhere between a year to 3 years. In most cases, 3 years, especially back then. And these days, maybe a little bit different depending on your level of knowledge, but a lot's expected of you for a conversion process. And it's shorthanded into this phrase circumcision. And if we go all the way back to the first verse of the chapter, that really sets the precedent, right? Because there's a second question is introduced at verse 5, I believe. Yeah, at verse 5. But the primary question, verse 1, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So the question is, do you have to be converted into Judaism to be saved? That's the question of Acts 15. Go ahead.
Say it's also noteworthy that it's referred to as the custom of Moses. So we're not talking about something in the written Torah here. This is actually a direct reference to what would be the oral tradition, right?
Mhm.
You don't refer to Torah law as custom. It's never referred to as custom. Custom would be something other than the written Torah.
That would be custom is a tradition. It's a minhag. It's a tradition. Yeah. And they're admitting that this is a tradition. And then, so verse 5, we have the addition, right, from those of the parties of the Pharisees who had believed. It is necessary to circumcise them and command them to keep the Torah of Moses, or the law of Moses, whatever translation you happen to be using. So that's a small addition to the whole thing. And it would make sense that Pharisees would make that small addition. It was like, well, not only do they need to be converted, but once they convert, now you have to be observant, right? Because you've converted. So, that's a small addition, but the main focus here is still the idea of conversion. Does one have to convert? This sets the precedent for the letter that gets written as a result of this debate. So, and you said it. What's the burden that neither he nor his forefathers could bear? It's a conversion process. It's incredibly difficult. And if you were a born Jew, you've never had to go through it. You have no idea what that's like. And in many cases, it's much easier, right, for you to just kind of go back into an observant lifestyle, because you don't have, it's not the same thing. You don't have to go through a conversion process. You're already there. And I've said this in the past. It's kind of a controversial statement, but I'll say it and pass it off to you. But the conversion process is so difficult that there are some natural born Jews who wouldn't make the cut. I mean,
yeah. Even in this day,
Yeah. So that's the burden. That's the yoke. It's not the yoke of Torah, which is rarely ever used that way, by the way.
Right.